having the state do everything, having the state come in and provide the kind of offset to the harsh, ugly realities of regular capitalism, that's not a program anymore.
Don't expect much from the political class because traditionally they respond only when they're frightened, and it's our job to make them frightened.
We're in a shock doctrine moment, and people on the left who say, okay, yes, but the time isn't now because we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the labor infrastructure, the ducks aren't in a row enough for us to actually take advantage of this moment.
I see all around me lots of evidence that Americans are more in their heads thinking about big changes than I have ever seen in my lifetime.
Well, I've got both of you two here who are two of the biggest minds and most respected minds on the left. I want us to get into that. I want us to start to try to answer some of these questions, because what it starts to feel like to me, I do all of these interviews, and it starts to feel like in Bernie's absence, everyone's kind of waiting for someone else to take the lead. Everyone's kind of waiting for somebody else to draw up the blueprint, as it were. And you said something about in Bernie's wake, there's no organization and there's no kind of agenda. And I wonder how much Bernie and other progressive leaders are responsible for that, because there's an argument that says we have more elected representatives who identify as democratic socialists and progressives than at any time in modern history. They are enormously popular and have a certain degree of institutional freedom generated by the fact that they are fundraising powerhouses who have demonstrated an ability to ward off opposing challenges. AOC had more money spent to try to unseat her. It was the most expensive race in that cycle. And obviously she prevailed. You have these narrow margins in the House, which enable them to basically hold anything up if they want to. Similarly, Bernie Sanders in the Senate can hold anything up if he wants to. And while you are seeing the kind of agitation that I'd like to see around the infrastructure bill, with progressives saying, if you don't pass the reconciliation bill, we're not going to go for the bipartisan bill. You also see 9 corporate Dems doing what corporate Dems always have done, very boldly, without any fanfare, like, of course, we're going to do the exact same thing. And historically, if I had to place a bet, I would probably gamble on the corporate Dems, because progressives have advertised explicitly over and over and over again that because we care about our constituents and because we're not monsters, we'll always compromise and take what we can get, because we got to deliver for our constituents because we have hearts and they don't. They have basically, they advertise constantly that they will always bend the knee, and they blame their compassion for the people as the reason why. Now, I understand that. as an ethical position, but as a political position, it seems extremely short-sighted. So I guess my question to both of you is, how much should we be holding leadership responsible, and what would you like to see them doing differently? What could Bernie have done differently in the fallout and at the end of his campaign that might have helped to solve this problem of listlessness on the left?
Well, let me start with that. I don't think that the decisions they make are ethical. They are practical. They ensure their own political survival, because Pelosi would destroy them otherwise. And the problem is, of course, the focus on the political leadership. The political class, even the best of the political class, is never going to free us from bondage. That's going to be done through movements. And if you look at the early 20th century, before World War I, the socialist movement, which was united with the union movement, was an incredibly powerful force. I think Rick can correct me if I'm wrong. I think we had 30 socialist mayors. We had, of course, Eugene V. Debs. At one point, I think it was the 1912 election, I can't remember, pulling 6% of the vote. The ruling elites were terrified. That's why Wilson, under the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, went after the left, deporting Emma Goldman. And that's our focus. We have to forget about AOC. She's window dressing. She has no real political power. And of course, Bernie, I'm much more critical of Bernie, perhaps than you are, Brianna. He wasn't building a political revolution. It was political advertising for his campaign, which is why it all collapsed. He never took on the war industry. Indeed, he supported it because it gave jobs to constituents in Vermont. And he wouldn't confront Schumer and the Democratic power hierarchy, which are as responsible, especially on the Clinton administration, for neoliberalism and deindustrialization and deregulation and essentially turning government into an entity that exclusively caters to and serves the interests of corporate power and the oligarchic elite. And so I don't dislike Bernie. I don't think he's dishonest in any way, but he's spineless. And he, in the end, chose his career. He did not want to confront Schumer. And the power of Schumer and Pelosi is that they are the funnel for the money. So all the Wall Street money comes through them and it goes to the anointed candidates. And if you defy their interests, which are neoliberal, they're not even liberal, they're not even traditionally democratic, then they'll destroy you. And they can destroy you by turning off the spigot and funding. And this has been going all the way back to Tony Coelho in the Clinton administration. This has been the transformation of the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. And Bernie knows this. But remember, Bernie campaigned for Bill Clinton in 1996. That was after NAFTA, after the omnibus crime bill, which has, 40% of the people in our prisons are in for selling marijuana or, nonviolent drug crimes. I mean, this is nuts. The court system doesn't work. All of that was pushed through by Clinton and Biden, by the way. Biden was instrumental in all of that. So I think the focus is wrong. Don't expect much from the political class because traditionally they respond only when they're frightened. And it's our job to make them frightened. And I said it so often that some of the viewers may have already heard it, but I'll say it again. 1971, tens of thousands of anti-war demonstrators surround the White House. This is in Kissinger's memoirs. As I also say, don't ever buy the book. And Kissinger's describing Nixon. He's freaking out. He's got empty city buses all around, ringed around the White House to protect him. And he's looking through the window and going, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's our job. That's where we want people in power to be. Max Weber writes about this. So in his little essay, brilliant essay, Politics as a Vocation. And he says, the moment you turn your back on the centers of power, they go right back to creating systems of exploitation and oppression. And that's the problem. We turned our back. We put our faith in AOC or Bernie. These are brands in the same way that Obama was a brand. I think Obama exposed him for his emptiness and hollowness in his 60th birthday party. It was all on public display. But everyone in Chicago, I know the great Jeremiah Wright, admired Jerry very much. Jerry knew this, not that anybody wanted to hear it. He knew what Obama was about. And so forget Washington. It's our job to build movements, as Rick said, and we're going to have to build movements with people whose political expressions are far worse than anything that, Williamson or anyone else is going to. So we're going to have to build coalitions with people like my family. And I love my family, although I don't want to hear much of what they think about Black people or homosexuals or, there's an endless list, unless you're white Protestant from Mechanic Falls, Maine. But you know what? We're going to have to build those coalitions around fundamental issues of justice, around fundamental issues of employment, around fundamental issues of public service, of public schools, etc. And we're going to have to come together on those issues. But of course, the left which I think is just rapidly becoming a caricature of itself, is extinguishing its political relevance.
But look, the problem is, okay, put elected officials to the side. A lot of folks on the left have become so invested in those figureheads that even that aspect of the argument is going to turn them off. That's part of why Jimmy Dore is so maligned right now, is that he at times makes an argument that it's not worth even giving your money to campaigns when it could be better spent doing other kinds of organizing efforts. And obviously it's a free country. People can choose to do what they want. But there's a lot of tension around on the left right now about whether or not certain people should have done more to help Senator Nina Turner, for example. And I think, while it's obviously true that Senator Turner would, being in the Senate, being in the Congress on the House would be better than Shontel Brown being in the House, I think it's also fair to have some skepticism about what these people can accomplish at the end of the day. And so my follow-up question is to ask, do you think it's worthwhile to still pursue and engage in these kind of electoral left efforts if it means getting people into the fray, pulling people into the movement, getting an audience, because there are people who are going to be attracted to electoralism? Or do you agree with the kind of Jimmy Dore approach that says it's not worth funding these candidates, it's not worth paying attention to them at all, they're kind of like sucking too much momentum out of the movement?
I would be a little more nuanced. I like Nina. I think Nina's great. And I certainly have no problem with supporting her. On the other hand, if there aren't movements out there that are able to put pressure on the centers of power, it doesn't matter how well-intentioned, I think she is well-intentioned, how well-intentioned she is, she's going to be politically emasculated, given the way the system is configured. So I don't divorce myself. I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter, but Ralph's argument was, and I have not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since before 2000. Ralph's argument, which I believe, is that, if we can pull 5, 10, 15 million of people away from the Democratic Party, that is the only mechanism we have left to put pressure on the Democratic Party to begin to address the needs of working men and women and the working poor. And I think Ralph was right. Ralph never thought he was going to win. I don't think Ralph wanted to win. I know Ralph really well. He's kind of the least political, politician I've ever met. But I think that's right. We have to begin to build pressure points, and that means that we have to cross the demographic divide, which unfortunately, and Matt Taibbi's book lays this out in Hate versus Hate, where he's got Sean Hannity on one side of the cover and Rachel Maddow on the other. The media model is now to cater to a particular divide and tell that divide what that particular demographic silo, what it wants to hear, and then demonize the other demographic. That's what Fox does. That's what CNN does. That's what MSNBC does. I think that's what the New York Times did in their horrible Caliphate podcast, which all of us who came out of the Middle East realized was essentially an audio snuff piece. But it catered to, how people see Muslims in this country. So we're going to have to cross that divide, and we don't have any allies now within the system to do that.
Well, let's talk about that absence of allies, because Professor Wolff, you brought up earlier unions, labor. I believe it was you, Professor Wolff, as the historical kind of seeding ground for these kinds of movements. And oftentimes what you hear on the institutional left right now is, yes, that's the historical trajectory. Yes, that's how things have historically been done. But we have such low union density that we can't take certain kinds of actions that others on the left want to be taken in the context of the crisis that we're in, right? So union density is low, therefore it's not the time for a general strike. If no one's talking, there's no conversation even really to be had about the strike, the October 15th, I believe, general strike that people have been murmuring about a little bit, because it almost feels like to talk about it is to undermine your own credibility on the left. There is very little, I think, in terms very little concrete development or preparation for a student debt strike that could be well timed to the end of the student debt moratorium, which is now at the end of January. And Biden says that's going to be the absolute last extension. A lot of really well-meaning people on the left kind of gesture at these moments of potential inflection point, but there seems to be this unwillingness to commit, to really ask people to donate to a strike fund, to do mutual aid, to offer whatever kind of support that can make those amongst us who are going to really bear the burden of these kinds of efforts feel supported and be supported economically. What do you think that's about? I mean, are you also observing this tension between we're in a shock doctrine moment and people on the left who say, okay, yes, but the time isn't now because we don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the labor infrastructure. The ducks aren't in a row enough for us to actually take advantage of this moment.
The only time you know that the ducks are in a row is when it's over and the ducks have shown up that they can stand in a row. I mean, this game of predicting where we are and what we can do now, yeah, you always have to do a little of that, but you always have to do it with an enormous grain of salt that no one knows exactly what is going to happen or how it's going to happen. The last 2 weeks of the departure of the U.S. from Afghanistan after having 20 years to plan gives you an idea of how much under control, even situations that you might imagine were pretty well under control, aren't. So I don't know what's going to happen on the 15th of October. I don't know what it takes to get people to move, but I'm sure that one of the ways you get people to move is to start moving yourself. Get out there together with those you can persuade to go with you and start to do it. And that even if you fail, the very act, the very effort has its own momentum building capabilities. Anyone who's followed this kind of thing, Margaret Mead loved to remind everyone that don't put down when it's only 6 people gathering in somebody's kitchen starting about making a revolution, because that's how every revolution began. When there were just 6 people in a kitchen getting together to do it. Doesn't mean when you get 6 people, you'll have a revolution. But it does imply that if you don't get those 6 people together, you're not advancing the revolution one iota by your conversation about what is and is not. You know, in the old socialist movement, this debate happened in the last century, particularly with a discussion of the objective versus the subjective conditions. You know, objectively, people are hungry, people have no job, but are they in their heads subjectively able and willing to step forward? I see all around me lots of evidence that Americans are more in their heads thinking about big changes than I have ever seen in my lifetime. The way I want? No. And with the detail, with the nuance, with the historical clarity, with the theoretical, sophistication? No. All of that needs to be improved. All of that is in not adequate shape. But when the Gallup poll keeps telling us that the people 35 and younger are like split over the socialism versus capitalism, I understand. They don't know that much about what socialism is. They're really voting that they're disgusted with capitalism. They're disappointed. They're upset. But that's a lot to work with. And it's a lot more than the people 20 years ago thought they had to work with. So how much more exactly do we need before we get off our proverbial rear ends and begin to make the effort? I think in the labor movement, you're seeing it, because you raised that and I want to raise it again. You're seeing it, whether it's those miners in Alabama or the workers at Amazon or the nurses in Massachusetts or the college teaching assistants in California. I mean, I can make a long list of lots of activity. And the champion of the general strike idea was Sarah Nelson, who's the head of the air attending, folks in the airplanes, et cetera, et cetera. So she's able to be. She was rumored to be one of the conceivable successors to Trumka, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are the basics for the coalitions that Chris was talking about, and one of those coalitions, which is fraught with tension, I get that, but is a coalition between those who run for office and work within that environment with all of its constraints, and those of us that are not in the political arena as candidates and are trying to build the movements. And if we do, it'll put a lot of pressure on those politicians, and they will put the brakes in some, and we will have fights, as all powerful coalition partners always do, whether it's above or below the radar. And that's our future. That's the best we can do. And again, my energy, my sense of what's needed is organization and programmatic clarity about what it is you are joining when you are joining a movement. And I am grateful to Bernie. He opened the space, and I will always be grateful to Bernie for having the courage to do that. But I also have my disagreements, many of them like Chris's, about building an organization and building clarity of a program. He had one line in his economic program about co-ops. He put it in there to his credit, and I was glad to see it. But that was it. Even the British Labour Party had a developed program about co-ops, which he could have taken over hook, line, and sinker. It would have given him some real substance. He chose not to do it. Another mystery to me.
One of my frustrations, and I say this, at the risk of doing more left infighting, but part of the infighting is for all the reasons, superficial reasons we talked about before. But I think part of it is because Force the Vote exposed different degrees of willingness to be adversarial and to actually do a kind of politics that involves the kind of threat that you were describing, Professor Hedges. So whether it's vote withholding, whether it's withholding donations to candidates, whether, a more kind of, not just marching in the street and like asking nicely or even asking not nicely, but to have a credible threat in exchange, voting third party, whatever it is. It does seem like some actors on the left have the effect, wittingly or not, of demobilizing people by, I think accurately articulating a plan forward, but one that has a longer trajectory and which is contingent on a number of other factors that seem very serious and thought out. And, okay, well, we're going to get, there's this conversation about the PRO Act. And well, the number one thing the left should be focusing right now is the PRO Act. I mean, great, let's fight for the PRO Act. But, we also know that it is contingent on Joe Biden and the filibuster, as is everything else. And it seems almost cherry picked among all the other points of inflection, including obviously Force the Vote, which wasn't contingent on Biden in that way, which was a real, or forcing the vote over a $15 minimum wage or whatever other ask that you want, even if it's not the Medicare for all floor vote, which to me is really incidental in all of this. It's all about the real issue here, not incidental, but the real core of this is whether or not you're willing to really gum up the works and pose a real threat in order to get some agenda item crossed. And my concern is that while I don't want there to be these kind of superficial levels of infighting, that there are some actors who have the effect of channeling the interest in Bernie into a kind of acquiescence to a Biden administration. And we're just going to do neoliberalism for the next 8 years. And you're a silly goat for thinking that you should be agitating for anything more than incrementalism at this time. Look at Our Revolution explicitly coming out with a kind of revised mission statement saying we're just going to do Bidenism for the foreseeable future.
Well, look, I mean, that Force the Vote didn't work. Why didn't it work? Because Nancy Pelosi has a lot of power, and the few people who might have gotten behind Force the Vote don't have any power. So within the system itself...
You said that last time, Professor Hedges, when we were on the show, and I pushed back against you a little bit. Because when you say they don't have any power, what do you mean? It feels like what you really mean, what you're really saying is they are choosing not to fall on the sword. They are choosing their careers. They actually do very, very directly have the power to prevent Nancy Pelosi from being Speaker of the House. Right. But they are choosing not to exercise that power because they put their own career and their ability to stay in Congress above using that power. Right.
They don't have the ability to put pressure on Nancy Pelosi. And you're right. That's a good point. They could choose political suicide.
Well, here's the other thing. Look, can we talk that through a little bit, Professor Hedges? Because what does that look like? It's political suicide for them to not vote for Nancy Pelosi. What happens next? Because we talked this through a little bit on a recent episode I had with Ari Robinhoft, who was Bernie's deputy campaign manager. And I asked him the same series of questions. And he basically made the same point. And I pushed back and said, okay, well, what if, AOC said that she would rather be a one-term congressperson than compromise her values. So let her be a one-term that's what she said. I didn't put that on her. Do you know what I mean? So why not say, I am going to be willing to incur the wrath of the beast, not at all minimizing what that wrath is, for the sake of exposing how opposed elected Democrats are to the interests of their constituents.
Because 99.9% of people who go into politics don't have that moral backbone. Dennis Kucinich does. Dennis Kucinich, after one term, was driven out of his office as mayor of Cleveland by the big banks. They threw the city in default because he wouldn't privatize the public utility. And then, of course, the Democratic Party, which was sick of Kucinich, did redistricting in a way that pushed him out of the House. He's now running again for the mayor's office in Cleveland. But it's very rare. George McGovern did. George McGovern took on the Democratic Party establishment. And then, interestingly enough, after the 1972 elections, took on the meat and dairy industry for the animal ag industry and its health effects. And he was finished. And so that's one of the things that Ralph Nader charts really well. It's the way the Democratic Party became utterly subservient to corporate interests and destroyed its liberal wing. Nader wrote 24 pieces of legislation: the Mine and Safety Act, the Clean Water Act, OSHA. All this was written by Ralph, but it was pushed through Congress by liberal Democrats. And one by one, Ralph watched those liberal Democrats be destroyed. And so that's the problem. And they have all the power. They put all the pressure, which is why we have just moved incrementally towards, the Democratic Party in Europe would be a far-right party. In essence, what Clinton did is transform the Democratic Party into the Republican Party and push the Republican Party so far to the right it became insane. That's what happened. And so the destruction of the true liberal element, not the Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama faux liberalism. Remember, Margaret Thatcher said her greatest creation was Tony Blair. And Richard Nixon's greatest creation was Bill Clinton. Or Barack Obama, or Joe Biden. Although Biden was picked by Obama to be vice president because in all but name, he was a Republican. His voting record was completely Republican. So the fact is, unless that we build movements that can counter the power of the water carriers for Wall Street and big business and the defense industry, like Pelosi or Schumer, then those people, however well-meaning AOC may be or anyone else, and I don't know her, I've never met her, she may be, then we can't go anywhere. So that's the point. And politics is a game of fear. And we've lost the ability to make them afraid. And that's what we have to recover, which is why general strikes, all this kind of stuff, that's where all of our energy has to go. We have to unionize places like Walmart. And when you unionize places in Walmart, and there's a Walmart that destroyed the town, much of my family, Norway, Maine, the whole Main Street is now boarded up because everybody goes to Walmart, which pays minimum wage. People are still below the poverty line because they only work 28 hours. So they qualify for food stamps, and all the money's profits are just vacuumed out of the community. This is just repeated across the United States. Walmart is a really dark enterprise that has to be destroyed. And we have to do it. That's where our energy has to go. And once we put our energy into confronting the real epicenters of power, and then we begin to make that power afraid, then we can talk about political effectiveness. Well,
half the left, here's what I keep coming back to, though. Half the left thinks that you shouldn't talk about third parties. Half the left literally calls the other half the dumb left for articulating any value or interest in third-party candidacies. Half the left thinks that the other half of the left is monstrous villains who attack women of color for critiquing the efficacy of squad members. Right? This is literally half of the left, and I'm not trying to describe them using, I'm not trying to undermine them, use, divisive language here, but, one might call them the institutional left, is doing the work, I would argue, of backing people away from exactly those strategies that would create fear that is useful for us. And they're doing it under the cover of saying, well, we have all of these team players on the inside, we have to protect them now, right? They're prioritizing the political careers of individuals as though that's a stand-in for our political good interest. And that is part of why I don't, the House discourse is silly. But when people say, okay, well, my critique of Hasan Piker, and this is a critique that I've seen that I'm articulating, I'm not, staking a claim here, but that, because he is opposed to third parties, because he, generally speaking, is, defensive of the squad members, because he wasn't supportive of efforts like Force the Vote, that is part of why we're frustrated that he has been able to earn so much money and buy this house, let's say. and that the people who are doing the best in the left ecosystem are the people, not frankly Jimmy Dore, he's an outlier there, I'd say, but are the people who have kind of closed ranks around lefty institutional actors, perhaps for access reasons, perhaps who knows why. It could be sincere sympathies. But that's part of what's motivating, I think, this fracture. It's not all superficial.
Yeah, but what you're describing are boutique activists. You're not describing real activists. So let me describe to you real activists.
Sure.
I have taught for 10 years in the New Jersey prison system. I've also taught at Princeton, Columbia, and a few other places. The brightest, most politically astute students I've ever had are inside the prison system. If they get, this is through Rutgers University, it's a great program, they can get their BA in the prison, and if they get out and they have a 3.1, they can matriculate to Rutgers. Well, my students matriculated to Rutgers, and they're now unionizing, working to unionize the service workers at Rutgers. That's real activism. That's where our energy has to go. And it's done, these people they're almost all Black, but they're not traditional liberals. They're radicals. And they're unionizing people who probably voted for Trump. It doesn't matter. They know where the center of power is. They know what they have to do to organize, and they're doing it. And that's where our hope lies. When I went to seminary, I went to Harvard Divinity School. Poor Rick also went to Harvard. And I lived in Roxbury, and I commuted into Cambridge every day. And that's where I say I learned to hate liberals. All these people sitting around talking about empowering people they never met. I went back on the Green Line. They could go, it's a 20-minute ride to the projects in Roxbury, but they weren't going there. They were flying off to Nicaragua to pick coffee a week with the Sandinistas and coming back and talking about it for the rest of the semester. Those are the kind of activists you're speaking about, boutique activists who have traditionally been and remain utterly irrelevant, not important, and not worth your time or your energy even responding to.
Well, that's go ahead.
Let me amplify that
Sure.
in a way and describe to you meetings that happen on an almost daily basis in the European socialist movement.
Okay.
Here's how the meeting goes. You have a bunch of people who are elected by the Socialist Party or the Green Party or the Communist Party or the Left Party, and they have all of those in Europe. And together they're half of a country or more in most cases, right? Those people sit around with the activists, the union leaders, the social movement leaders. In France, for example, it's the Yellow Vest movement, the activists in the language that Chris just used. And the activists explain to the people who sit in parliament, you need us, because when we make noise in the street, you can parade around as the more reasonable version of all of this.
Right.
And you can get things done you cannot get done if we're not out here, to use Chris's language, scaring the pants off people of what might be coming. So don't act as our adversaries, because you aren't. You're actually our allies, and we are yours. And we want from you this, this, and this. And you're going to get from us this, this, and this. It's a coalition. We have something to give. We have something to take. We are not getting exactly what we want, but together we're building a movement. And here's the ways we want you to help us build our movement in the streets, because we are, in fact, helping you build your power base. And that means also that you can quit on an issue of principle, because we have a place in a movement for you to do other things, and maybe even run for office again, and maybe in another place, and maybe for a higher. Or, in other words, you need us even to be what you claim to be in favor of. If you build your coalition right, you can work it that way. You don't have to see it as a choice either or. You need each other. The labor movement needs people in there to get laws that might not have been passed or rules softened that might have hurt more. And the people need that social movement because that's who's going to vote them in, etc. On that basis, all kinds of things can be done. But if you don't try that, then you're left with the excuse, gee, we can't do it because there isn't a movement. But, I remember once Obama telling people who went to visit him in the White House, I can't do the things you're asking. I need a mass movement. Go out there and make a movement, then I can do these things. And the minute we had the Occupy Wall Street movement, Mr. Obama destroyed it. So there wouldn't be the movement he said he wanted to enable him to do all these things. I mean, this relationship can be sour for both sides, or it can be very powerful. That's up to us.
Right. Well, it also seems to be, to a certain degree, up to these elected officials who don't seem to have the attitude that having outside pressure is helpful and that can make them seem like the reasonable, serious ones in the room. And you see that in part because, and this is saying this is going to get me some grifter accusations, but, it seems in part because there is not a relationship even between the elected left figures and the kind of left media that is probably the best connector between them and the kind of issues that people are agitating for on the ground. So, a couple of weeks ago, there was a big brouhaha because journalist Max Blumenthal has a conversation with Cori Bush on the steps of Congress when she was doing the sleep-in that got the eviction moratorium extended. And they had a reasonable conversation. And then at the end, he asked her about force the vote, at which point two of her staffers interjected and kind of blocked him, and she walked away. And again, the institutional left media covered that as Max Blumenthal being very aggressive and hostile, and why are we still talking about force the vote, and yada, yada, yada. And he's attacking a woman of color and all of that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, well, I would put to Cori Bush, you won't get ambushed. I heard that she didn't want to talk. She wanted to keep the focus on the eviction moratorium. Fair enough. If you don't want to get ambushed at the steps of the Capitol or at Medicare for All marches or what have you about force the vote, sit down and have one good interview with a left media outlet about your decision-making process. Explain to us what's going on. Feed the left infrastructure so that it can grow and be more powerful in the way that the right infrastructure can help all of its candidates when the mainstream media opposes somebody like Trump. And create a solidaristic relationship where you're telling us what the game plan is and how we can help and vice versa. But that 100% doesn't exist. And I would argue that half of the left is perfectly fine with that arrangement.
Well, Brianna, look, what Max did is called journalism. We're not stenographers. It's not our job to go and abide by whatever strictures or public relations campaign anybody, even Booker, who I like, has. That's not our job.
Right.
They have lots of public relations people that do that. And so what Max did his job.
Right.
And that's kind of the sad state that we're in, and this is a whole other show. I mean, what's happened to journalism itself has just been destroyed in any meaningful way. And it's why real journalists like Taibbi or Greenwald or myself or anyone else have been pushed so far to the margins. None of us are on even MSNBC. We can't get on any of that. Power is always the problem, and some forms of power are more benign than others. But in that sense, I buy kind of, along with Chomsky, this kind of anarchist relationship to power. And again, this goes back to Weber. Weber understood this really well. And just to pick up a point, because I meant to say it before when Rick was talking about objective and subjective, the person who wrote the best on this was Rosa Luxemburg, who understood that there's also the big debate among the socialist movement. What happens if people are hungry? Well, let's let them get even hungrier because then it will further the revolution. And Luxemburg, and it's worth going back and reading, wrote, that's just, we can't be heartless. We have to address both the subjective and objective issues before us, which means that we have to work as hard as we can to provide food as we do to carry out revolution. And I think that's right, because we can't be without pity for suffering. That should be what is driving us. We have to respond to that suffering. And at the same time, we have to understand the systems of power that orchestrate and profit off of that suffering to bring them down.
Well, that brings us back to the point that we started with, which is the skepticism that some folks have, rightly or wrongly, whatever's driving it, jealousy, what have you, of folks on the left who do get rich enough that they are perceived as being out of touch, that they aren't doing the mutual aid, that they don't seem to be fighting for, the argument is they must not be fighting so hard to feed the poor or to help the worst amongst us if they have the disposable income to do X, Y, and Z. And someone might say it about someone who buys a $3 million house. Someone might say about Bernie for having 3 houses. Someone might say it about me because of the luxurious, sometimes overpriced candles that I buy for my studio apartment. We're all culpable to some degrees. We're all above the average American income and far above the poverty levels, which are set far lower than they should be. And so I don't know, I don't want to be dismissive of that skepticism. I think that there's some utility to being challenged to have more of the perspective of the students that you talked about that you taught in prison, who seem to be more focused, perhaps in part because they have a closer relationship to real struggle. And is there something to be said about kind of a class identity politics having value there? Hey, YouTube, don't forget this is a podcast. To get full episodes, including ones that are behind a paywall, go to patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. To get more episodes, please do subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and like this video.